I regret very much that I couldn't, for health and family reasons, I couldn't be with you this week and today. But technology provides us with the second best solution. And I'm very thankful to Ricardo Pelés from Ibagué University and to Staffan Lindström here at Lund University to make this solution a reality. This is just to show you where I'm sitting. At the moment, I'm sitting just under the roof where the arrow shows at this magnificent building, which is a main building at the Lund University, inaugurated by the king in 1882. And here the university has furnished a conference room, a video conference room. In case someone wonders, could I have my picture there? There you see a piece of an art behind me. That is part of the structure holding up the roof, and I can assure you it's very stable. I'd like to introduce the learning curves part of my talk by a personal note on a very local experience from here in Lund. I live on the top floor of an 8 stories, 50 years old building. One day I was notified that all elevators in that building would be exchanged for modern and safer ones. The exchange would be done by one project team going from one elevator to the next. The building has 8 entrances, with one elevator for each entrance and no possibility of passage between the entrances. The point was that the exchange was calculated to take 3 weeks, and during that time there would be no elevator service for that entrance. So first I somehow despaired, forecasting a crisis after 2 weeks when I would run out of fresh food. Then learning curves came to my rescue. It occurred to me that in the moment the team started its work, they would actually have operational closure. The team would be the master of all its operations. In the words of Maturana and Varela, they would develop an identity specified by a network of dynamic processes whose effects do not leave that network. And this is, of course, quite interesting because operational closure is the major condition for applying my cybernetic theory for learning curves. It would mean that the learning rate of this team would be 20%. And also from the team's perspective, their job was unique. That means that they really started from the top of their learning curve. So that meant for me that the 3 weeks of no elevator service only applied to the first entrance, which was not mine. From the perspective of the team, it meant that only the first exchange would take 15 workdays because, of course, their clock, the team of the clock, only ticks on workdays. So one would have a 20% reduction at each doubling of accomplished elevator exchanges. As my entrance was number 4, it meant I was 2 doubling from 1 to 2, from 2 to 4. It meant that the refurbishing would be completed in 9.6 workdays. Now, after 9 workdays plus a weekend of climbing stairs, I bravely walked up to the elevator and pressed the button. There was a slight hesitation, and then the doors of the new elevators slid open for me. The learning curves had asserted themselves on the evening of the 9th workday, and of course also confirmed the cybernetic analysis. Now, my elevator experience has anecdotal value, but it illustrates important questions on applications, assertion, and benefits of learning curves. Let us explore the learning curve further by looking at a documented and well-documented case. This is the learning curve for the team installing offshore wind turbines outside of Denmark at Horns Rev. They installed, notice that you have a double logarithmic diagram in front of you. And the number of turbines in the wind park is 80. In the beginning, it took 3 work days, to install the first. For the very last ones, it took less than 1 workday. So actually, if you look at the effect of the learning curve, you find that on the green triangle, which I hope is shown there by you, and it turns out that more than 1/3 you reduced the number of workdays, the total number of workdays, by more than 1/3 due to the learning effect. That's quite drastic, of course. Now, if you start to see what is the actual learning equation for that line that you see in front of you, it is deviously simple. It just says that the workdays per turbine, that is on the y-axis, is equal to a constant C0 times the number of turbines installed raised to the minus E, where E is the experience parameter that we will return to several times during this speech. And the learning rate has a very simple relation to this experience parameter. Now you can find that this learning equation has a very simple cybernetic interpretation. It shows the learning system as a feedback-regulated system. Input workdays, output turbine installed, and the workdays per turbine is dependent on the total feedback from the number of turbines already installed. So one could say also, of course, this is for historical regions. One works with this equation of work times per turbine, but in fact, if you would invert both of the sides of this equation, you could say that the performance depends on the cumulative feedback from the output. I think we take with us this last piece, that workdays and turbines installed, but we generalize it for our purpose of looking into energy and climate policy. We have a learning system with an input-output, and it is feedback regulated. Before we continue, one has to make 3 methodological observations here. The first one is trivial. As you proceed up the recursive ladder from project level up to industry and individual firms, the input will of course be measured by cost, and the cost will then be the sum of all the inputs that you have, that is labor, capital, materials, and so on. And for energy purposes, the output will then be measured in kilowatt or kilowatt hours or barrels per oil equivalent, whatever you can find as is interested from an energy point of view. The second observation is that as you would really like to have cost data all through, but policy will require that you go to industry, and in that case it's very, very difficult to obtain cost data. So you have to rely instead on price. The international literature has accepted this limitation with the argument that in a competitive and equilibrium market, price and cost follow each other with a constant ratio. So the learning rates are the same, whether you measure them in cost or in price. But it is the thing that you have to keep in mind, that when you talk about many of the learning curves that you have for energy policy, it's actually not cost per output. Methodologically, it will be price there. Now, the third observation here is interesting. We are looking at a system whose performance is decided by the cumulative output. That is, it's decided by its history. And then following from Förster, you will find that this learning system is a non-trivial machine. And that's something that we will return to later on. Now, the learning curves and energy policy brings up many issues. And I would like in this talk to bring up three important questions. First, to which learning systems and technologies can learning curves be applied? Second, what is actually the policy message coming out from these learning curves? And third, how much can we trust the extrapolations of the learning curves? And the last one is, of course, a quite important one. Now, the first one has to do with the realm of the learning curve. And it turns out, and this comes out from any type of empirical investigation you make, the learning curves pervade all competitive industrial activities. Now, the controversy begins when you look at the policy message. Because the policy message is no learning, no cost reductions without market action. Now that means not, of course, when you go to emerging technologies, which are really of interest here, emerging low-carbon technologies, that they are usually too costly in the beginning to even be thought about as a solution by most of the actors on the market. So you need government deployment programs to help these technologies to reach market. And then, of course, you open yourself to accusations that governments are intervening on the markets. And they are paying a lot of money, both directly for these subsidies, and they are also picking winners. That is the critique coming. So then you go back to what is actually the status of the learning curves. Can you really trust them and their extrapolations? Are they stable? Are they reliable enough to say, to give the recommendation to the government, go ahead with your deployment programs because the benefits are larger than the cost? So we come to the third question here, reliability and stability. And in order to say anything about that, we need some type of theoretical explanation of the learning curves. But here, mainstream economics and second-order cybernetics come to completely different conclusions. First, on learning rates, and secondly, on learning curve and the shape of the learning curve, which means different policy recommendations. Now, I will talk and illustrate very briefly the two first questions here to give you a first impression of what's at stake. And then I will use the second half of my talk to talk about the third point, the theoretical explanation. So I will start by illustrating the pervasive learning curve by showing you some examples of frequency distributions of learning rates. What you are looking at now is the frequency distributions of measured learning rates in 108 cases. And this is from individual firms in different industries. The industries are actually ranging over a broad spectrum from textiles to semiconductors. And the point is here, it is only measurements by cost, which is interesting. And as you see, you have a median between 19 and 20%, which is nice from the theoretical standpoint. It follows quite well the cybernetic theory. But it is also a rather wide distribution, and it has a tendency to be asymmetrical. All this must be explained by a theoretical explanation. We move one step up to industry level. In that case, it is price. And what you see there to the right is one of the first measurements by McDonald and Schattenholzer at IASA in Vienna. You have 42 cases of energy technology ranging from renewables, fossil, nuclear, and energy efficiency. You have the same peak around 19 to 20 as you find in the left diagram, but you have a tendency to a second peak at 4 to 8%, which is, of course, bad message for energy policy. But it is there, and it's interesting that, as I will show, the cybernetic theory actually forecast that second peak. So let's proceed to the solar PV modules to illustrate the issues for deployment policies. Here you have the learning curves for solar photovoltaic modules, and now in price on the y-axis, and the cumulative global shipment on the x-axis. Global because this is a global technology. The red curve is a fit to the observed prices. As you see, it is taken from 1976 to 2001, and it goes from around 300 kilowatt cumulative shipments to over 1 gigawatt. That is roughly 4 orders of magnitude. It follows very nicely a learning curve of 20%. But what shall we say about the policymaker standing there at 2002 and asking himself, what shall I do? Shall I continue with my deployment policies? Because it has been mainly deployment programs that had brought in this photovoltaic modules into the energy system. He is looking for a break-even, and now you have to watch out. This is logarithmic axis, so he needs to have 300 to 400 gigawatt. That's an extra 300 to 400 times what he has when he stands in 2002. And the cost, of course, of doing all this is actually the red triangle that you have there. And that amounts to between 100 and 200 billion US dollars. And don't be deceived now by the logarithmic scale, because the policymaker in 2002 actually has to make sure that he can provide over $100 billion to achieve a break-even. And worse to it, because there is such a long extrapolation period there, just few changes in the learning rates will change the break-even point very much. And the money that he will have to put up with can easily double just by losing a few percentage points on the learning rates. Now the red one that's actually already where our controversy starts. The economists would call that subsidies. You have to subsidize this technology. But I will follow the terminology of IEA, International Energy Agency, in their book from 2000, and call it learning investments, because you are really investing in something in order to obtain benefits later on. So what you have here is, as you see, the learning investments. Now, because of the uncertainties, you do need a realistic assessment of learning curves and to decide on long-term deployment programs, both avoiding missing opportunities. That is, if you say, no, the uncertainty is too big, I'm not doing it. Then you are at risk of missing opportunities. And of course, if you believe too strongly, you are at the risk of overspending. So as a consequence, it's a theoretical grounding that is needed. And this is now what I will turn to. And the first question to put, what is the basis for the observed learning? Is it features, events, processes, or is it operational closure? If you turn to mainstream economics, it's quite clear that they are saying we have to identify features, events, and processes that lead to improved performance. And a good example, actually, in the literature is almost a benchmark example. It's a work from Gregory Nemeth in 2006. He looked at 7 different types of FEPs to explain the curve that you just saw. It was, among others, the module efficiency going up as a result of R&D activities. You had plant size, economics of scale. You have silicon cost, it's the input, and you have yield, which actually is to handle waste better. How did he succeed? Well, moderately. If he looked at the whole curve from 76 to 2001, he actually only could explain 60% of the reduction in cost. If he looked at this period and cut it in 2, he find a very good explanation by the 7 FEPs for the latter part of this experience curve. But you could also launch critique on this approach from a more methodological standpoint. Aren't the mainstream economists actually mixing causes and effects? I mean, if you look at it from, let's say, a cybernetic point of view, you would say you have a learning system and it uses these FEPs in order to achieve what it wants, but it will have no fidelity to each of these. It will take any one when it is useful. And there is a very interesting work by Chihiro Watanabe and his co-workers from 2000, where they looked at the PV production system with feedback and in Japan. They found feedback loops binding together a very wide net of operations. And more to it, because the R&D is always, how to treat the R&D is always something which is widely discussed. He made a good distinction between private industry R&D, which he found was entangled in this network, and the public R&D, which was actually only, or not only, it was an external source of knowledge to the system. So this is, I would say, you are almost halfway there to looking at the system as an operationally closed system. So if you proceed and take the next step with second-order cybernetics, you come to the conclusion that the learning curves express the eigenbehavior of the operationally closed learning system. And as more and more types of operations are folded into the network, you get, of course, a larger and larger network of operations. And the R&D classified operations, of course, become very important in this network as you move up to the firm and industry levels. Now, we can take this second-order cybernetics one step further and try to see if we can make a formalism. And I know in the minute at a speech like this, you name the words formalism, you lose a large part of the audience. But I assure you I will try to avoid as possible any comments about the mathematics here. I will start by using this simple interpretation of the non-trivial learning machine. As you see, it is just, the learning system is just seen as containing two types of operations. It's producing and computing. And the producing is only a trivial machine which has a performance which is decided by the internal state, here marked by Z. The computing part is accepting feedback from internally and also over the market. And when the market is in equilibrium, it is really no flux passed in the external loop. We just look at the internal loop and what is done there. And very important is then something called marked with SRL, standing for the self-reflecting loop. That is where the assessment and design comes in, and that is where you have a change in the Z of the internal state as a result of the assessment of the observations that is coming through the internal and external loops. And here is the matrix of operators that I use. I'm not going into them at all. There is an open access publication for anyone who wants to look at it. And the most important part is, of course, the diagonal operators. And if you take them and put the off-diagonal operators equal to 0, that's when you simulate equilibrium markets, and that's how you obtain, when you let the mathematics do, the eigenvalues for the experience parameters, and find that you have a spectrum of learning rates from 20%, 7%, 4%, etc. But the off-diagonal operators, the W's, are very interesting if you have to see how this system handles perturbations. And I have tried with using a non-zero operator W12, assuming that the perturbations present themselves following a Poisson distribution around the eigenvalues. And these are the results. And now what was earlier presented to you as frequency diagrams, I have here as distribution diagrams. So on the x-axis you have the experience parameter, and on the y-axis the number of cumulative cases. The lines there, the straight vertical lines, just shows you where you find in this diagram the eigenvalue, the 20% and the 7%, etc. And you see that for the left diagram, which is the Dutton-Thomas that we saw before, the one that only looked at firms and cost, there is no indication of higher order eigenvalues. It's all explained by the 20%. And the fit with the help of the perturbation is quite good. On the right-hand side, you see also a very good fit. with 3 parameters in principle, but there you also see that there's coming in much more of the higher states. In this case, I've only used one of these. Well, let's sum up what we have achieved so far. The cybernetic theory for learning curves can explain observed distributions of learning rates, which is actually much more than any of the mainstream economics explanations can do. But it uses an operator technique to extract those distributions, and the assumed form of the operators rely on the shape of the learning curves. So we are only half through, actually. We need to find ways of theoretically ground the shape of the learning curves. That is the learning equation. We have to explain the learning equations. And this is where we turn to, all right, we first have to ask ourselves, how is this handled by the mainstream economics? Well, they are true to their FEP approach, and we take the work by Ferrioli and Swan from 2009 and 2012 as an exponent of this type of work, and they assume that they have a lot of FEPs randomly distributed in calendar time that generate a learning curve. And actually what they do in principle is that they fix a learning, the costs at both ends of the studied period and see whether they can generate a learning curve that is a power relation for the cumulative output with the help of that. So they have externally fixed the endpoints of the curve, and they can in some cases generate quite well the behavior of cost reductions between the endpoints. And their conclusion is that every improvement that reduces cost can result in a power law relation between cost and cumulative production. And then damning, of course, for deployment programs, the learning rate cannot be considered a constant property. Now, if you turn to second-order cybernetics, the conclusion there is that the learning system moves in eigentime, and the learning curve describes a path of minimum entropy production. That is, the learning curve is actually an optimality criterion. The critique against the mainstream economics is that it's an observer-centric fallacy. They give the observer a privileged position. It is like saying that, as to a physicist, that it is not possible to observe pi mesons at the surface of the Earth. They are produced by very high up in the atmosphere, and should actually a long time ago, after 10 or 15 meters, decayed. But in principle, we observe them at the level of the sea, which tells you that these mesons actually are moving in their own eigentime as prescribed by the relativistic physics. And what I would say there is that the idea of eigentime is just bread and butter when you go to physics, actually also when you go to chemistry or even to biology. So the task is then to find the relation between the eigentime tau of the learning system and calendar time of the observer. And then if we bring up the fact that the learning system is a non-trivial machine, we would say that we expect eigentime to be a function of cumulative output. And let's proceed, because in order to do some calculations on this, we have to take a thermodynamic perspective on technology learning, that is non-equilibrium thermodynamics. We would say then that the input and output that you have is related to the net flow of entropy input in or out of the system, and that there are two sources of entropy production inside the system, that is the external and internal feedback loops, while the SRL are standing for the force moving these fluxes. The assumption is that this system is in a steady state, which means that the net inflow of entropy is equal to the entropy produced. And the competitive market is at market equilibrium, but then has a double role. It keeps the thermodynamic in a non-equilibrium state, and it ensures minimum entropy production. And then, if you have a minimum entropy production, this is constant in eigentime. And with the help of this, and of course a lot of algebra, which I won't bother you with, you come up with this relation between eigentime and calendar time. And this, at the case of exponential growth, which was what Ferrioli and Swan was looking at it turns out that the eigentime is proportional to calendar time, but only in that case. And you then take something from statistical physics, assuming that the input and output are proportional to accessible phase space, and that gives you then the learning equation. So what we have done with this is actually we have started to build a bridge between the learning curve and non-equilibrium thermodynamics. It's not up to me to say it's a stable bridge or not. I think it is. It's up to my peers, but it's a start. And that means, of course, that you have docked the whole learning curve ideas to a very large body of established knowledge. So from this I draw the conclusion that the learning curve is a stable, fundamental property, and is apt for use in deployment. And now you can go back to our learning curve for PV modules, and you can look at it all the way up to 2010. And the red curve now is not a fit to the points. It's a fully theoretical learning curve, fitted in one point only, which can be arbitrarily chosen. You have to just ensure that it is the markets are in equilibrium during that period, and you have a very good fit to the learning curve, except of course for the period that came after 2002. So without the theoretical explanation, our policymaker would be in trouble. But if he believes this theoretical explanation, he will just sleep well during that period, because everyone is agree that this bubble is due to silicon scarcity. It was just the fact that the governments were so interested in having deployment that they had a too quick exponential growth. It was up in 37% per year in this period. So they ran out. The people ran out of the silicon, and this, of course, was to great amusement to the people who owned the factories to make silicon. But now by 2010. There is a lot of new factories coming online. That is why you find, and very interestingly, the prices back on the learning curve. And you could also make the reflection that if the governments had cooperated on their deployment programs, one might avoid the extra cost of $100 billion to the world economy. So I wish I had have bought some shares into silicon factories at 2002. So our conclusion then. Well, what about deployment programs and energy climate policy? I think that the question they have to put is, shall we have a market-led or a technology-led strategy? The market-led would mean that you rely on, let's say, carbon taxes. You rely on emission trading schemes, like in the EU, for instance. And of course, you would still have an occasional deployment programs, but I think the recommendation from the mainstream economists would be you had to put your money on R&D programs. And technology-led would mean that you go for the deployment programs, but you still would like to have, of course, general policy measures in order to make the whole thing work. But the leadership would be taken over by deployment programs. This reflects a little bit of the debate that is now going on in the European Union. That is, how many objectives shall you have for the climate and energy policy? Shall we just have one objective for the CO2 emissions? Or shall we also have objectives for renewable technology and energy efficiency? So if you go for market-led ones, you go for general carbon policy measures with occasional R&D support. For a technology-led, you will put much stress, like they have done in Germany, for instance, on deployment programs, of course, with some support from general measures. And I leave for you to reflect over, because either way, you have, of course, you have the cybernetics methodology helps you. So I leave you to reflect over those two loops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for listening to me.